Hey guys, how are you? Today we're going to be talking about how to start a drawing from scratch, specifically how to start a drawing of a two-object still life that contains a lot of reflections. So part one of this tutorial is going to cover form and measuring and drawing the actual shapes of the objects. And part two of this tutorial will cover more of the technical nitty-gritty of how to shade all of the values. So let's go ahead and get started. What you need today as far as materials go are a sketchbook or a clean piece of paper. Any old-fashioned pencil will do, something light, something very erasable, and then an eraser. These are great tools for the beginning part of your project. Later on, you will need to end up getting some sort of dark pencil, which we will talk about at the beginning of part two. Let's first take a look at what we're actually drawing. Now, it could be a still life set up like this with two objects, or it could be any old thing that you've set up for yourself. Something I recommend is placing your objects on a stable surface against a relatively plain backdrop. If you want to be a little bit more artistic and add an extra degree of challenge, you can put a flat fabric behind it, sort of billowing or flowing out from behind. That can look very nice. But I wanted to kind of make a slightly more pared down version of a reflection tutorial because the reflections themselves are already very challenging. Here's an image of two objects that I took a photograph of. I arranged them in a way that I thought would be pleasing. I believe that in the end of all things, it will be a balanced composition. And it gives me enough reflection because of the direct light to draw a very dramatic lights along with the very dark shadows in the background. I think will look pretty good. The first thing that you'll want to do before you start drawing anything is decide whether you want to make your paper horizontal or vertical. In this case, my composition is going to be much higher than it is wide, so I would want to make mine in the vertical or portrait position, allowing for the maximum height I can to fill up my paper full of most of my objects. The next thing that you have to do is decide about how big you want your composition to be. I highly recommend not making very small compositions on a large sheet of paper. It will look off balance and a little awkward. So what I always do is I make a couple of little helper marks like so, allowing for a little bit of a distance all the way around my paper, but kind of having an approximate idea of how tall I want to make my objects. Now it's time to start drawing. What you need to do is be able to see your objects all the time. Anyone who's good at drawing is good at observing. So whether you have your computer set up where you can see a photograph or you've got your still life set up in front of you, you need to be able to look up and down at your paper and your subject in very close succession. I often draw while I am looking. So let's look at our photograph here. Something that you'll notice is that the smaller jar is a bit lower than the bottle itself. So a very easy thing to observe. You don't want to put them on the same level. Something that you also want to do is do some sort of initial sketch or measuring to ensure that your proportions are going to be correct. In academic circles and the way I was taught, using your pencil as a unit of measurement can be very helpful visually. If it's right in front of you, if you're drawing from life, if you extend your arm and line up the top of your pencil with the top of a smaller object that you're going to start with, and your fingers with the bottom of that object, and then you can use that as a special unit of measurement to measure everything else by it. Let's just say you're drawing an orange with a vase. If you line up this little unit of measurement visually with that orange, you can therefore see how many oranges additionally would it take to get to the top of the vase or bottle, whatever it is that you're drawing. So in this case, I only have two objects. They're similarly sized, but one is smaller than the other. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw the approximate location of both objects, but then I'm going to initially develop my smaller object so I can use it as a unit of measurement to continue drawing my larger object in good proportion with itself. Let's go ahead and get started with our smaller objects here. I always like to do kind of an initial sketch. That's called a gesture sketch, just to kind of get the feeling of things, and this should be very, very light. This is a very approximate, non-committal sketch of your objects. This is just for a kind of general size and placement. General size and placement only. We are looking back and forth at our objects an awful lot, but we are not thinking of each line as something that we're sticking with. This is simply to make sure we're getting the size and placement of our overall composition where we want it to be. Observe things like in my still life, like the smaller jar being lower than that larger bottle. Okay? You want to make sure to center everything, kind of get a general idea of like, all right, this is about where I want to place things. Whether or not you want to include things like the edges of your table is something that you might want to consider. It really is up to you. If you're going to be a little bit more of a purist, you will include the edges of the table. So that's what that extra space around the outside was for. Being able to include things like the cast shadow and the edges of the table. So it's filling up a good portion of our page. It appears to be relatively centered, and our initial sketch is finished. This is not the one you're going to stick with. This is simply, again, for size and placement only. Now it's time to get more specific. What you want to do is find a smaller object. In this case, there are only two objects, so really it's like, which one should I choose? It is the shorter of the two objects. That would be that smaller vase on the right-hand side. I might call it a jar. Sorry, jar, vase, boss. So what we want to do is start from one end and go to the other. So our first concern is getting good bones, good structure, and form in our drawing. So now that we've kind of got everything slapped on there, what we're going to do is we're going to start with a smaller object here. And we're going to draw right on top of our gesture drawing. We're just going to make it more accurate. Once we've drawn that first initial smaller part, such as that little rounded part that you may see there, now we have a smaller little unit that we can say, how many little bulbous parts does it take me to get to the top of my jar? And therefore we won't make our jar either too short or too tall. So what I do is I hold out my pencil, I line it up with what I'm seeing, the very top and the bottom. Kind of visually I'm lining it up like this, but I'm holding out my arm and doing that. And then what I'm simply going to do is I'm going to move my arm up like this visually and then ask myself, how many of these little bulbous parts does it take to get to the top? So I'm going to do that right now. It looks like it takes about one more of these little bulbous parts to get to the top. So what I've sketched out here is relatively accurate. So if I take this one more unit up, remember that I'm transposing proportions. I'm not doing this literally because my picture is actually much smaller than the drawing I'm making. So you're just transferring proportions. You're not transferring the actual scale of the whole thing. So I'm going to look very carefully, try and make it as accurate as I can. It looks like it bulges out a little ways. I'm looking back and forth constantly. And now that we've drawn a more accurate version of our bottle here, one that we can trust a little bit more, we can use it to measure our second object. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to measure again, and essentially visually I'm going to be doing this. I'm going to be saying how many bottles would it take me to, or how many vases would it take me to get to the top of my bottle. So essentially with my arm, as I'm holding it out and measuring my picture, I can go like this and ask, where is the top of my bottle? Is it one vase up? Is it less? Is it more? So I'm going to do that right now. It looks like it is not one full vase tall, the top of the bottle. It's about 2/3 of the vase. So if I kind of find about 2/3 of my vase, carry that up here, that's about how tall it is, which is, surprise, surprise, really close to my gesture sketch that I initially drew. That's why measurement at this very initial stage is very important. You don't want to stretch things out, make them too fat, make them too wide. So you can do that height-wise, and you can also do that width-wise, where I can compare it to my little vase down here and say, how wide is my next object? Okay, so if I take that and go like this, but on my picture, how many vase widths wide until I get to the next side of my bottle, that will help me enormously. Something you should always note is where is my second object coming out of my first object. So if you kind of visualize a halfway mark through the kind of bulbous part of your vase here, and then look back at the picture that we're using for today's example, you'll see that it's about halfway through where you actually encounter the bottom of that bottle. It's about halfway through. So that way we don't put them on the same level. Something that I find helpful sometimes is I hold out my pencil like this visually and I line it up with whatever I'm drawing, whatever picture or whatever still life I'm drawing, just to gauge what am I looking at. Is it a little bit more slanted up? Is it a little bit more slanted down? Because your brain will want to trick you every time. Your brain assumes things are a certain shape, but they really aren't. It assumes things are a certain height, so you really have to go back and compare them. All right, so I stop here at my helper mark, and I can go a little bit more straight up. It looks like my bottle is pretty close to straight up, maybe a little bit of a slant to the left. And I need to see where this side line ends. Where does the side line end compared to my first object? You're always going back to your first object to compare it to, okay? This is actually relatively easy because if you look at the length of this line, where does it end? What is it right across from? It's right across from the lip of our vase here. So you should start kind of rounding it off right about there, right across from the end of the vase. So round it off there and change directions of your line. As I work my way into the objects further, I'm going to start recording a lot of these smaller objects that are made by the different values. The really whites being called highlights, that direct light are very distinct shapes, but there are a lot of different little shapes in reflective objects. So as I continue on, I'm going to start drawing those tiny little shapes, almost like a jigsaw puzzle or a visual map. This will make shading more accurate and also save you a lot of pain down the road. Instead of going back to fix mistakes, you can do it right more the first time. It can be very helpful to make what's called a structural line drawing, composing all those small shapes that compose the greater whole. Something you should keep in mind as you continue drawing is that it's never too late to make corrections. You'll see that I'll be making some corrections here, and that's okay, and that's why you draw lightly at first. Something else that you should keep in mind is that the interior of reflective shapes, especially transparent things like glass, do not play by conventional rules. They often bend in unconventional ways. You can see on the inside of the small vase that the back of the table actually bends downwards, but then corrects itself as soon as it exits the glass area. Don't forget to include cast shadows because they too will show that your objects are taking up physical space, and they're also a little bit unconventional because they will vary in their lightness or darkness depending on what part of the dark shadow that you draw. Something that also can help as you finish up your structural line drawing is to draw slightly darker lines for areas that will be in shadow and leave slightly lighter lines for those areas that will be in the highest light. That's it for now. Make sure to tune in for part 2 next time.